"Get back!" David Klein shouted, his voice bouncing off the wet stone walls. Ranger's growl locked deep in his chest as the false panel gave way, and a small hand, no bigger than a child's, reached out through the crack. Somewhere behind that wall, a girl was crying, and behind her, 6 more waited in the dark, breathing shallow, afraid the flashlight was another trick. Before we go any further, tell us in the comments what part of the world you're listening from right now, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story like this one. The rain had been falling over Millbrook, Ohio for 2 straight days. It was the kind of rain that soaked the streetlights until they looked like smudges of yellow bleeding down the glass. The kind that turned every backyard into a black puddle and every ditch into a small river. In a town of 6,000 people, tucked into a bend of the Great Miami River, that much water made everything smell like wet leaves and old wood, and it made every phone call to the police station sound a little more urgent than it really was. Officer David Klein was 34 years old, 6 feet even, and had the kind of steady quiet about him that came from raising a daughter by himself for the last 5 years. His wife had left when Emma was 3. She had wanted a different life, one that did not involve waking up at 4 in the morning to walk a dog through the woods before shift. One that did not involve sitting up until midnight cleaning a uniform. David had not tried to stop her. He had signed what she put in front of him, kept the house, kept the girl, and kept the dog. That last part had turned out to be the thing that mattered most. Ranger was 5 years old, a Belgian Malinois with a chest like a barrel and eyes that did not blink when they locked onto something. David had raised him from a pup, had trained him through the State Academy in Columbus, and had partnered with him every single shift for the last 3 years. Ranger slept at the foot of Emma's bed on nights when the wind was loud. Ranger walked her to the school bus stop on Tuesdays when David worked the overnight and slept until 8. Ranger was not a pet. Ranger was family, and Ranger was better at reading a scene than most humans David had ever worked with. The call came in at 4:20 in the afternoon. A woman named Marla Peterson, who lived on Kettle Creek Road, had been driving her son home from soccer practice when they cut through Hadley Road to save time. Kettle Creek was flooded near the bridge, and Hadley was the only other way through. Marla said she had heard a sound coming from the old Ballard place. A knocking sound, she said. Not the wind. A knocking that had rhythm to it. 3 quick knocks, a pause, 3 more. She had slowed the car, rolled down the window, and listened for a full minute. Then she had driven straight to a gas station and called the police. Detective Beth Morris was the one who saw the report first. She was 41, small-framed, with hair the color of dry hay, and a mouth that never quite settled into a smile. She had been a detective in Millbrook for 11 years, and before that, she had worked juvenile cases in Cincinnati. She had seen things in Cincinnati that had put a permanent tension in the base of her jaw. She had come to Millbrook to slow down. That had lasted about 8 months, until she had started noticing a pattern that nobody else seemed to be tracking. Missing girls. Not 1, not 2, 9 across 4 counties in the last 20 months. All of them between the ages of 9 and 15. All of them taken during the school year, from small towns, from families that did not have the money or the connections to keep the story in the news for more than a week. Beth had been putting a corkboard together in her spare bedroom for over a year. Red string, index cards, printed photographs. Her ex-partner in Cincinnati had told her she was chasing ghosts. Her captain in Millbrook had told her gently that she needed a hobby. When the report came across her desk about a knocking sound at the old Ballard place, she did not, in that moment, connect it to anything on her board. It was just a noise complaint at a vacant house. She sent it to patrol. That was how it landed with David Klein. He read it while he was standing at the coffee pot in the break room, and he almost handed it off to the rookie. But there was something about the way it was written, a knocking with rhythm. 3. Pause. 3. He had a bad feeling about the word rhythm. Random noise did not have rhythm. Wind did not have rhythm. Rats in the walls did not knock in sets of 3. He grabbed his rain jacket and whistled for Ranger. The drive out to Hadley Road took 12 minutes. The colonial house sat at the end of a gravel driveway that had gone to weed, its white paint peeling in long strips and its shutters hanging at broken angles. There had been a family named Ballard living there once, an old couple who had lost their son in a car accident on the interstate and had themselves passed away within a year of each other. Nobody in town had ever bought the house. The estate had gotten tangled up in something out of state, and the property had been sitting empty for nearly 4 years, growing over a little more each spring. David killed the engine. The rain hit the roof of the cruiser hard enough to sound like static. Ranger sat up straight in the back and made a low sound in his throat, one that David had learned to trust more than any lab report. "Yeah," David said. "I feel it too." He opened the door, and the dog was out and past him before his boots hit the mud. Ranger did not go to the front porch. He did not sweep the yard. He went straight around the side of the house, nose low, ears pinned flat against his skull, moving with the purpose of an animal who had already decided what he was looking for. David followed with one hand on his radio and the other on his flashlight. The cellar doors were on the north side of the house, half sunken into the ground. Their green paint bubbled and cracked. There was a rusted padlock hanging from a hasp that had been pried away from the wood on one side and then hammered back into place with a different set of nails. That alone would have been enough to make David uneasy. A house that had been vacant for 4 years should not have fresh nails anywhere on it. Ranger stopped at the doors. He did not bark. He did not scratch. He pressed his snout against the wood and held it there, and then he sat down, exactly the way he had been trained to sit down when he found what he had been sent to find. His body went perfectly still. Only his tail moved, one slow sweep across the wet grass. David crouched next to him. "Good boy," he whispered. "Stay." He reached for his radio. He did not use the general channel. He asked for Detective Beth Morris by name, and he asked her to come alone with backup. No lights, no sirens. He did not explain why. He knew Beth well enough to know she would not ask. She arrived in 8 minutes in an unmarked sedan, with a patrol car following 2 lengths behind. Officer Ray Delaney was driving the patrol. Ray was 28 and had been on the force for 4 years. David liked him. Everyone liked Ray. He had that easy way about him that made drunks calm down before they got in the back of the car. Beth got out into the rain without an umbrella and walked over to David and Ranger. She looked at the dog. Ranger did not turn his head. "How long has he been sitting like that?" she asked. 11 minutes, David said, "since I got here." "Any sound?" "None. Just the alert." She nodded once. She'd worked with Ranger before. She knew what it meant when the Malinois sat like a statue and would not look away. "Ray," she called, "bring the bar." Ray brought a pry bar from the trunk of the cruiser. It took him 3 tries to get the doors open. The old wood squealed. The rusted padlock finally gave way and skittered off into the weeds. The doors swung up and back, and the smell came out of the hole in the ground like something exhaling. It was not the smell of a rotting animal. It was worse than that in a way. It was the smell of damp earth and human sweat and unwashed skin and something like old fear. David had smelled it once before, in a foreclosure in Springfield, where a squatter had been living in a crawl space for 6 weeks. But this was denser. This was more. Beth put her hand across her mouth. Ray took a step back. Ranger did not move. "Hello?" Beth called down into the dark. Nothing answered. She looked at David. He nodded. He drew his sidearm, kept it pointed at the ground, and started down the steps with his flashlight raised. Ranger went with him. staying tight against his left leg. Beth followed with her own light. Ray waited at the top of the stairs with his weapon drawn, radio in his other hand, watching the yard. The cellar was low, maybe 6 feet at the ceiling, with a packed dirt floor that had turned to a soft mud in places from the rain leaking through. Old shelves stood against one wall, empty except for a few rusted paint cans and a coil of wire. A pile of newspapers had rotted into a black mass in one corner. It looked exactly like every abandoned cellar in Ohio, except that at the far end there was a wall that did not belong. It was framed in fresh 2x4s. Not new, the wood had grayed a little, and the corners had begun to soften with moisture, but it had not been built when the house was built. It was maybe 2 years old, maybe 3. Someone had put up a partition across the back third of the cellar, and behind that partition someone had drywalled and painted the surface a pale, uneven gray. Ranger walked straight to it. He sniffed along the base. He sat down again in front of a section that looked no different from the rest of the wall. David turned to Beth. She was already reaching for her flashlight to put it in her teeth, freeing both hands. She ran her palms across the paint, pressing gently, working left to right and top to bottom. About 4 feet from the floor, near a seam, her fingers found a give in the surface. She pushed. Something inside clicked. A panel about 18 inches wide and 4 feet tall swung inward on hidden hinges. The smell came out again, harder, and then, from somewhere behind the panel, a voice. "Is someone there?" It was the voice of a girl. It was thin. It was cracked. It was so quiet that if the rain had been coming down any louder outside, David would not have heard it. It sounded like someone who had not spoken above a whisper in a very, very long time. Beth got down on her knees in the mud. She put her flashlight through the opening and swept it slow. "My name is Beth," she said, keeping her voice calm and steady, the way she had been trained to speak to hostages. "I'm with the police. I'm here to help you. Can you tell me your name?" For a long moment there was only silence and the sound of breathing. Then the voice came again, closer this time. "There's more of us." "How many?" Beth asked. 7. Beth's face did not change. David had seen her get news like that a dozen times, and he had never once seen her face change. She just nodded, as if the girl had told her the time. "Sweetheart, I need you to move back from the door," she said. "We're going to open it wider. We're going to bring lights in. We're not going to hurt you. You are safe now. Do you understand me?" "Yes." She said the word like it took every bit of strength she had left. Beth stood up. She turned to David. In the beam of his flashlight, her eyes had gone the color of steel. "Call for a bus," she said. "Call for 4 buses. Call the state. And keep the press off this until every one of them is out of here and in a bed somewhere." David was already on his radio. The next 2 hours were the longest of his career. 2 ambulances came from Millbrook. A 3rd came from the county hospital. A 4th came all the way from Dayton. 2 additional patrol units arrived, and Beth waved them into positions around the perimeter of the property. The rain kept falling. The panel in the wall came off completely, and behind it they found a sub-basement. It was not much larger than a small living room, maybe 14 feet by 12. It had been dug into the earth below the original cellar floor. The ceiling was low enough that a grown man could not stand up straight in it. There was a single bulb hanging from a wire, but it was not on. There was a bucket in one corner. There were 7 thin mattresses on the floor, arranged in 2 rows. There was a stack of plastic water bottles by the wall, most of them empty. There were wrappers from granola bars and packets of crackers. There was a stack of children's books, faded and stained. There was no bathroom, no window, no second door. The girls were sitting up against the far wall when the paramedics came through. They were holding on to each other. The youngest was 9 years old. Her name, they would later learn, was Emma Reeves. David had a hard time with the name. His own daughter was named Emma. He did not let himself think about that until much later. The oldest was 15, and her name was Chloe Hardin. She was the one who had spoken. She was the one who had known that if anyone ever came, she would be the one who had to answer. She had been down there for over a year. They came out one at a time, wrapped in silver blankets, carried by paramedics who spoke in low voices and did not look at each other. Their eyes could not handle the light of the cellar bulbs, so the paramedics had brought soft cloths to lay across their faces during the climb-up. They flinched at the sound of the rain. They flinched at the smell of the outside air. One of them, an 11-year-old named Sarah Whitfield, threw up on the way up the stairs, quietly and without complaint, as if she had been trained not to make noise. Ranger sat at the base of the cellar steps the entire time. He did not move. He watched the paramedics come and go. His ears stayed up. His body stayed alert. When Chloe was carried up last of the 7, the paramedic paused halfway across the cellar floor because Chloe had lifted her hand and made a small sound in her throat. She was looking at the dog. The paramedic looked at David. David nodded. They set Chloe down for a moment, still wrapped in the blanket, and she reached out with one thin hand and pressed it flat against Ranger's side. The dog did not move. He did not turn his head. He let her keep her hand there for what felt like a full minute, and then a little longer. Then the paramedic lifted her again, and they climbed up out of the cellar into the rain. David let out a breath he had not known he was holding. He was going to remember that moment for the rest of his life. He did not know yet that it was going to save at least one more life before the week was out. Beth stayed behind in the sub-basement with a state investigator named Karen Fitzpatrick and 2 evidence technicians. They photographed every square inch of it. They bagged the granola bar wrappers. They took prints off the bulb, off the doorframe, off the plastic bottles. They swept the floor for hair and fiber. It was Beth who found the bricks. The sub-basement had been walled with cinder block along 3 sides, but the 4th side, the wall closest to the house's original foundation, had been faced with old red brick. Some of the bricks looked older than others. One of them, near the floor, had mortar around it that was smoother and slightly lighter in color than the rest. Beth crouched down and worked at it with a screwdriver. It came out in her hand. The space behind it was small, maybe 4 inches by 6 inches by 2 inches deep. Inside, folded tight, was a small stack of papers. She unfolded them under the light. She read the first page. She read the second. She read the third. "David," she said. He came down the steps. He did not like the sound of her voice. She showed him the papers. They were not diary entries. They were not writing from any of the girls. They were the kind of thing a bookkeeper might have kept. Handwritten in blue ballpoint, in a small, tight hand. There were names on them. Not the names of the girls in the cellar, but different names. There were dates. There were vehicle descriptions. There were license plate numbers. There were locations. There was a column of dollar amounts. "This is a ledger," David said quietly. "It's a ledger," Beth said. "And whoever kept it, he was hiding it from someone, which means he didn't work alone." They looked at each other. The abandoned house on Hadley Road was not one man's crime. It was a station in something bigger, and whoever ran it was still out there. Chloe Hardin had been reported missing from a town called Covington 13 months earlier. Sarah Whitfield had come from a town outside Cincinnati. Emma Reeves had come from Xenia. The other 4 were from 3 separate counties. None of them had ever met before they had been brought to the cellar. That was the piece that had almost broken Beth when she had read the ledger. 7 girls, 4 counties, 1 house, and a book of names longer than any of them. Back at the station that night, Beth pulled every string she had. She woke up the county prosecutor. She called an old friend at the State Bureau of Criminal Investigation. She called the FBI office in Cincinnati. She stayed on the phone until 3 in the morning, sitting at her desk with a cup of coffee gone cold, moving pieces of paper into stacks. David went home to Emma. He did not tell her what he had seen. He sat on the edge of her bed and watched her sleep for almost an hour, and then he got up, made a sandwich he did not eat, and drove back to the station. Ranger came with him. Ranger did not want to be anywhere he was not. They spent the next morning in Beth's office, going through the ledger page by page. The names on it were girls' names. Some of them were girls from the sub-basement. Some of them were not. Beth had already put out the additional names to a national database. 3 of them came back as active missing person cases. 2 came back as closed cases where the girls had been found dead in a wooded area 2 years earlier and no one had ever been charged. One came back as a name that did not match any missing person report at all, which was, in some ways, the worst of them. The ledger also had a set of initials at the top of each page. JM, 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 every page. Whoever had written it, whoever had kept it, whoever had hidden it had signed it with those 2 letters at the top, like a receipt. John, Beth said, or James, or Joseph, or Jack. Some man whose first name starts with J and last name starts with M. And who knew the wall well enough to hide a stone there, David said. Which means he wasn't a visitor, Beth said. He was the one who built the wall. They worked the property records. The Ballard estate had passed to a distant nephew after the old couple had died, and the nephew, who lived in Arizona, had signed a management agreement 3 years ago with a company out of Toledo called Meridian Property Holdings. Meridian collected rent, filed the paperwork, and sent the nephew a monthly check. The nephew, when Beth got him on the phone, said he had never seen the house in his life and did not know anyone had been living in it. He was crying by the end of the call. Meridian Property Holdings was harder. It was a shell inside a shell. The Toledo address was a mailbox in a strip mall. The name on the state incorporation paperwork was a woman named Julia Marsh, but when Beth ran her through every database available, she came up with a woman who had died in 1991 in a car accident on Interstate 75. Someone had stolen a dead woman's name to sign an LLC. Julia Marsh, JM. That was one lead. The other came from the ledger itself. On the last page, in the margin, someone had written an address in a different hand. It was in Dayton, on the south side, in a district full of warehouses and rail yards. Next to the address, in the same different hand, someone had written the word move and had underlined it twice. That's not a delivery, Beth said. That's an evacuation. She put down the ledger and looked at David. They're already running, she said. That was the moment when everything that had happened since the day before turned into a countdown. Beth called her captain. The captain called the county prosecutor. The prosecutor said he needed 24 hours to draft a warrant application that would hold up in federal court. Beth pointed out that if they waited 24 hours, the warehouse would be empty and the men who had rented it would be in another state under other names. The captain agreed with her in principle. Then he told her to wait for the warrant. Beth walked out of his office and did not slam the door, but only because slamming the door would have been the kind of thing that gave a captain a reason to bench her. She went to David. "I'm going to Dayton," she said. "I don't have a warrant. I don't have jurisdiction. I have a hunch and a ledger. If I'm wrong, my career is over." David looked at her for a long time. "You're not wrong," he said, "and I'm coming with you. And so is Ranger." They took 2 unmarked cars. Ray Delaney insisted on coming too. Beth almost said no, because she did not want to drag anyone else into the trouble she was about to walk into. But Ray had that steady, friendly way about him, and she needed a third body. She said yes. The drive to Dayton took 40 minutes on wet roads. The warehouse sat on a dead-end street off Springboro Pike, boxed in between a scrapyard and a self-storage lot. The door on the loading side was open. That was the first thing Beth noticed as they pulled up. An open loading door in that kind of neighborhood, in the rain, was almost as loud as a shouted confession. She parked a block away. She got out with her sidearm holstered and her badge on her hip, and she walked up to the door alone. David and Ray stayed at the corner, out of sight. Ranger at David's left leg. The warehouse was empty. Not empty the way a vacant building is empty. Empty the way a room is empty when the people in it stood up and walked out 5 minutes ago and did not have time to sweep. There were coffee cups on a folding table. There was a cigarette still smoldering in an ashtray. There were tire marks on the concrete floor where a van had backed out through the loading door in the last hour. But they had been in too big a hurry. Beth found the phone first. It was sitting on the folding table next to the coffee cups. A cheap flip phone, the kind you buy at a gas station for cash. Someone had left it behind. She did not touch it. She stared at it and thought about how many pieces of information were sitting inside a device the size of her palm. David found the manifest next. It was on a clipboard, tacked to the wall next to a rolling door. It listed dates, cities, and single-letter codes. Beth understood immediately that the letters were codes for the girls. There were columns for pickups and deliveries. There were more codes than she wanted to count. Ranger found the last thing. The dog had wandered along the far wall, nose low, and had stopped at a section of pegboard where a set of keys had been hanging on a hook. Under the pegboard, on the floor, half tucked behind a stack of pallets, was a leather wallet. David picked it up with a glove. There was a driver's license inside. The photograph on the license was a man in his 50s, thin-faced, sandy hair going grey at the temples, mouth in a hard line. The name on the license was Jerome Marek. J.M. Beth was reading over his shoulder. "That's an Ohio license," she said. "Address on file is in Toledo, and I know that face." "How?" "Because he was on my corkboard," she said. "I couldn't remember his name yesterday. He was arrested 12 years ago on a soliciting charge in Cincinnati. He served 3 months. He disappeared after that. I always wondered where he went." They stared at the license. "He didn't disappear," David said. "No," Beth said. "He built a business. They called the FBI from the warehouse floor." Beth explained what they had found in the sub-basement, what they had found in the ledger, what they had found on the folding table, and what they had found in the wallet. The agent on the other end of the phone was quiet for a long time. Then he asked Beth to stay exactly where she was and not to touch anything else. 2 federal agents were on the road from Cincinnati within 20 minutes. Local Dayton police secured the perimeter. By nightfall, the warehouse had been photographed inside and out, and everything on the folding table and the pegboard had been bagged as evidence. The manhunt for Jerome Marek started that same night. Beth and David were sent home with instructions to write up their reports and stand by. Beth's captain called her at 11 in the evening and told her that under normal circumstances he would have suspended her without pay for going to Dayton without a warrant. Under the actual circumstances, he told her, he was going to put her name in for a commendation. He told her not to get used to the treatment. She hung up and cried for the first time in 3 years. David did not cry. David went home, sat at his kitchen table, and looked at a photograph of Chloe Hardin that the FBI had sent to Beth as part of the initial file. Chloe had been 14 when she was taken. She was in her school picture in a blue sweater with her hair braided over one shoulder and a shy, small smile. She was 15 now, sitting in a hospital bed in Millbrook, and David could not stop thinking about the way her hand had pressed against Ranger's side. He fed Ranger. He checked on Emma. He tried to sleep. He did not sleep. The next morning at 7:15, his phone rang. It was Beth. "They found the van," she said, "abandoned, off Interstate 75, north of Findlay. No sign of Marek." "He's running to Toledo," David said. "Probably," Beth said, "but that's not why I'm calling. I want you to come to the hospital. Chloe wants to talk to me. She won't talk to the state investigators. She said she would talk to the officer who was there with the dog. She said the dog. She said the dog first, actually, then the officer." David got Ranger in his coat and drove. The Millbrook Community Hospital was a small place, 2 stories, with a wing on the back for pediatrics. The 7 girls had been placed on that wing under the care of a doctor named Susan Hahn, who had spent the previous decade working with recovered abduction victims at a children's hospital in Chicago. Dr. Hahn had insisted on quiet. No press, no uniformed officers in the halls, no bright lights. Every window on the wing had been covered with soft curtains. The nurses wore muted colors. Beth met David at the door of the wing. She had not slept either. She looked older than she had the day before. "I brought Ranger," David said apologetically. Beth almost smiled. "She'll want him," she said. "Come on." Chloe was in a private room at the end of the hall. She was sitting up in bed, her hair washed but still short of shine, her arms thin under the hospital gown. She had eaten a little that morning. She was drinking water in small sips. When she saw David in the doorway, her eyes went to the dog first, exactly as Beth had said. Ranger did not need to be told. He walked across the room slowly, sat down at the side of the bed, and laid his head on the mattress next to her hand. She put her fingers on his ear. She did not say anything for a while. David and Beth sat in the 2 chairs by the wall. They waited. Finally, Chloe spoke. "There's a man," she said, "who came to the house sometimes. He was not the one who kept us there. He was different. He wore a suit. He would come down and count us, and then he would go back up. He never talked to us. He talked to the other man." "How often?" Beth asked gently. "Twice," Chloe said. "In the year I was there, maybe 3 times. I lost track of the days after a while." "What did he look like?" Chloe closed her eyes and thought. He was tall, taller than the other man. He had white hair on the sides and dark hair on top. He wore glasses with thin gold frames. He had a ring on his hand. On his right hand, not his left. It had a red stone. Beth was writing. "Anything else?" Chloe opened her eyes. He had a scar on the back of his hand, the same hand as the ring. It looked like a burn. It went from his wrist to his knuckle. Beth stopped writing. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. I looked at his hands. I always looked at hands. Hands are what you remember when you can't look at faces." Beth stood up. "Thank you, Chloe," she said. "You just gave us a lot." "Is he going to be caught?" "Yes." "Do you promise?" Beth looked at the girl for a long time. "I promise." David and Beth walked out into the hall. Beth was already dialing. "You know the man she's describing," David said. "I don't know him," Beth said, "but I've seen the ring and I've seen the scar." She stopped in the middle of the hall. She looked at David. 2 years ago, I went to a fundraiser at the community college. It was a benefit for the sheriff's re-election campaign. The main donor gave a speech. He shook every hand in the room. He shook mine. He was tall. He had white hair on the sides and dark on top. He wore gold glasses. He had a ring on his right hand with a red stone, and he had a burn scar on the back of that hand. He told me he had gotten it in a house fire when he was 12. She was pale. "What's his name?" David asked. "Warren Halsey," she said. "He owns 3 car dealerships and half the shopping strip on Route 73. He sits on the school board. He served 2 terms as a state representative before he decided he was too big for that." David felt the floor tilt. "That's the kind of man who does not fit in a cellar in Millbrook," he said. "No," Beth said, "he isn't. That's why nobody would ever look at him." They went back to the station. The next 48 hours were the tightest, hardest, most careful hours of Beth Morris's career. She did not tell her captain about Warren Halsey. She did not tell the local FBI office. She did not tell anyone she was not 100% sure of. She had learned painfully that a man with money and a school board seat had friends inside every building she might have walked into. If she said his name in the wrong room, he would be on a plane to a country without an extradition treaty before the end of the day. Instead, she called the federal agent in Cincinnati who had answered the phone at the warehouse. His name was Michael Ortiz. He was 39, a father of 2, and he had been working human trafficking cases for 11 years. Beth had known him for 6 of them. She trusted him more than she trusted her own captain. She drove to Cincinnati and met him at a diner off Interstate 71. She told him about the ring and the scar and Warren Halsey and the fundraiser and the way Chloe had described the tall man with the gold glasses. She told him about her captain. She told him about the school board and the state representative years and the 3 car dealerships. She told him about the shell company in Toledo, signed with a dead woman's name. Ortiz did not interrupt her. When she was done, he took out a small notebook and wrote 3 lines in it. Then he closed the notebook and put it in his pocket. "I have to be careful," he said. "You have to be more careful, but we're going to get him." "How long?" "Days, not weeks. He's already moving. He'll try to sell his interests and move liquid. We'll watch every account he has. We'll watch every phone he touches. If he tries to fly, we'll know." "He has a plane," Beth said. "He keeps it at the Middletown airport. He flies himself." "He won't fly it out," Ortiz said. "We already froze it 3 hours ago." She stared at him. "You already had him on a list." "I've had him on a list for 4 years, Ortiz said. "I just didn't have enough. Now I have enough." That was the first moment Beth allowed herself to believe that the case might actually end the way she wanted it to end. She drove back to Millbrook and did not tell David where she had been. She trusted him with her life, but he had Emma, and she did not want him to know anything that could later be used against him. She told him only that Federal was on it. He accepted that with the same steady quiet, he accepted most things. The next 3 days were public days. The Millbrook Police Department gave a press conference about the rescue of 7 girls from a hidden sub-basement in an abandoned house on Hadley Road. Beth's captain took most of the credit, which was fine with Beth, because it kept the reporters looking at him and not at her. Chloe Hardin's mother, Marie, drove up from Covington and did not leave her daughter's side for 80 hours. She slept in the chair. She ate what the nurses brought her. When she finally met David and Ranger in the hallway on the 3rd day, she took David's hand in both of hers and said the words, "Thank you," so many times that he had to gently ask her to stop because he was going to lose it. Then she got down on her knees on the hospital floor and put her face against Ranger's ruff and cried into his fur. The dog did not move. On the 4th night, Ortiz called Beth. "Halsey's driver dropped him at his house on Cliff Drive at 9:47, he said. "He hasn't come out. We have the perimeter. We move at 4 in the morning. I want you there." "I'll be there. Bring David and the dog." "Why the dog?" "Because if Halsey has already burned the paperwork in his safe, I want an alert dog on the property before we bring in a crew." She called David. He was already awake. Emma was at his sister's for the night because he had known this call might come. He put on his uniform. He put Ranger in the car. He drove to the meeting point at the Kroger parking lot off Route 73 at 3:15 in the morning. Beth was there. Ortiz was there with 6 federal agents. There were 2 Dayton SWAT vehicles. There was a state trooper unit. The rain had stopped, and the pavement was still slick and reflecting the sodium lights in long yellow smears. Ortiz went over the plan. Warren Halsey's house sat on a bluff above the river. 3 stories, 4 acres, a wrought iron gate at the road. There was a security system, but Ortiz's people had a workaround. There were 2 staff members who lived on the property in a guest cottage, a housekeeper and a groundskeeper, and both had been identified as unlikely to be involved. Halsey slept in a master bedroom on the 2nd floor at the east end of the house. His safe was in the study, on the ground floor, behind a bookcase. "We take the front door," Ortiz said. "We take the back door. We take the terrace. Klein, you and Ranger stay outside the study window. If anyone tries to come out that window with anything in their hands, you stop them. Do not fire unless fired upon. Do you understand?" "Yes." At 4 in the morning exactly they moved. The gate went first, then the front door, then the terrace doors. There was no gunfire. There was one shout, quickly cut off. Beth was inside within 30 seconds. She went straight for the study because Ortiz had said the safe was there. Warren Halsey was already in the study. He was in a dark blue silk robe. He was standing in front of the open safe. His hands were full of paper. He had a small canister of lighter fluid on the desk next to him and a box of long fireplace matches next to the canister. He had not gotten as far as the striking yet, but he had gotten as far as the pouring, and the air in the room smelled sharp and volatile. Beth had her weapon up. "Put it down," she said. "Put every single piece of paper in your hands down on the desk. Now." Halsey looked at her. He had gold glasses, exactly as Chloe had said. He had white hair on the sides and dark on top. He had a ring on his right hand with a red stone, and on the back of that hand, from wrist to knuckle, ran a burn scar. "You have no idea," he said quietly, "who you are talking to." "Yes, I do," Beth said. "You are Warren Halsey, and you are a man who kept a 9-year-old girl in a hole in the ground for 6 months, and I have you at gunpoint, and I would very much like you to give me a reason to fire." He put the papers down. Ortiz came through the doorway behind her with 2 agents. They cuffed Halsey with his own bathrobe still on. They walked him out through his own front door in his slippers. His housekeeper watched from the top of the guest cottage steps with a hand over her mouth. His groundskeeper was already sitting in the back of a patrol car for questioning, though he would be released within an hour, cleared of any knowledge. Outside the study window, David and Ranger did not have to do anything. They watched through the glass. They watched Beth put the weapon back in her holster. They watched Halsey being led away with his hands behind his back. They watched an agent step to the desk and start bagging every single piece of paper Halsey had almost burned. David let out a breath. Ranger looked up at him. The dog's tail moved once, slow, across the wet grass. "Yeah," David said. "Good boy." It was not over. It was never over that fast. But the hardest part was, Jerome Marek was picked up 2 days later at a truck stop in Sandusky, trying to buy a bus ticket to Cleveland with cash. He had cut his hair and dyed it black. He was carrying a passport with a different name. He did not resist. He told the arresting officers, as he was being cuffed, that he had known this day was coming for years. He said it the way a man says he had known a storm was coming. The network that had been running out of the Hadley Roadhouse and the Dayton Warehouse and the Toledo Shell Company turned out to reach into 3 states. Over the following 3 weeks, working from the ledger, the manifest, the phone from the folding table, and the papers from Halsey's safe, federal investigators arrested a total of 7 men. 2 of them were in Ohio, 2 were in Kentucky, 1 was in West Virginia, 1 was in Indiana. The last one was a lawyer in Louisville who had helped set up the shell companies and had on paper no criminal history at all. There was one more piece that Beth had to face, and it was the piece she had been dreading since the fundraiser 2 years earlier. Warren Halsey had not acted alone in Ohio either. He had been protected. He had been protected because he had been generous with campaign contributions and generous with dinner invitations and generous with weekends at his lake house. When the federal case went to trial, 3 names came up who had known things they should not have known and had said nothing. One of them was a sitting county commissioner. One of them was a lieutenant in the highway patrol. The third was Beth's own captain. That last one had come out in Halsey's own words. Halsey, sitting in a federal interview room, had tried to trade information for a reduced sentence. He had given up the commissioner. He had given up the lieutenant. He had given up Beth's captain, whose name he had said with the casual contempt of a man who had bought a man cheaply and was tired of pretending he had ever thought highly of him. Beth's captain was arrested on a Thursday morning in his own office. Beth was not there for it. She was at the hospital, sitting with Chloe Harden's mother, drinking coffee in the visitor's lounge. When she heard the news, she set the cup down carefully on the table, and then she walked out into the parking lot and stood in the sun for a long time, feeling the light on her face. David heard the news at home. He was in the yard with Emma and Ranger. throwing a tennis ball. Emma had picked up the ball from the wet grass and was drying it against her jacket. Ranger was waiting with his ears up. David's phone had buzzed in his pocket, and he had looked at it, and he had felt something in his chest unlock that he had not even known was locked. The captain who had told Beth to wait for the warrant was going to lose everything. The men who had used the Hadley Roadhouse were going to lose everything. Warren Halsey was going to spend the rest of his life in a federal prison in Indiana. The three girls, whose names had been in the ledger but who had not been at the Hadley Roadhouse, were going to be found, two of them alive, in a rented house outside Louisville, the third one at a truck stop in Tennessee. All 10 of them, in the end, were going to come home. David put his phone away and threw the ball. Ranger brought it back. Emma laughed, because Ranger's tongue was hanging sideways out of his mouth, and Emma was 7 years old and thought that was the funniest thing in the world. The 7 girls from the sub-basement were released from the hospital one by one over the next 2 weeks. Emma Reeves, the youngest, went home to Xenia in her mother's arms, the two of them wrapped in the same blanket in the passenger seat of an uncle's pickup. Sarah Whitfield went home to Cincinnati and immediately asked to see her cat, which had been kept at a neighbor's house since her disappearance. The cat, which was 14 years old and mostly slept, walked into her lap and stayed there for 2 straight hours. Chloe Hardin was the last to leave. Dr. Hahn had wanted to keep her longer because Chloe had been down there the longest, and because Chloe had held herself so tightly for so long that Dr. Hahn was worried about the crack when it came. The crack did come. It came at 3 in the morning on Chloe's 9th night at the hospital. She woke up screaming a name that turned out to be the name of one of the other girls, one who was already home, one who was safe. She screamed the name for almost 10 minutes before her mother, sleeping in the chair by the bed, could get her to understand that everyone was out. Dr. Hahn sat with them both for the rest of the night. After that, Chloe slept better. She began to speak more. She asked her mother questions about Covington, about her school, about her friends. She asked, on the 4th day, whether the dog was still in Millbrook. Her mother, who had learned by then that this was the question Chloe was going to ask, said yes. On the morning Chloe was discharged, David brought Ranger to the hospital. He was not on duty. He was in jeans and a sweater. Ranger was on a leash, but did not need one. They walked down the corridor of the pediatric wing, and the nurses smiled at them, and Dr. Hahn came out of her office to shake David's hand, and Marie Hardin met them at the door of Chloe's room, with tears already starting. Chloe was sitting up on the edge of the bed, dressed in real clothes for the first time in over a year, a pair of jeans that her mother had bought her the day before because none of her old jeans fit anymore. A grey sweatshirt with the name of a college on it that her mother had picked because it did not have any memories attached to it. Her hair, cut short by the nurses, was starting to catch a little of its old shine. She saw the dog. She smiled. It was the first real smile David had seen on her face. Ranger walked to her, sat down at her feet, and laid his head against her knee. She put her hand on the top of his head and let it stay there. "I wanted to say goodbye to him," she said without looking up. "He's not going anywhere," David said. "Millbrook is only a couple of hours from Covington. If you ever want to come see him, you say so. He'll be here." "Really? Really?" She kept her hand on the dog's head for a long time. Then she looked up at David. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything." "That first night, when you came down the stairs, why did you come? It was a noise complaint. Nobody comes for a noise complaint at an empty house." David thought about it. "The report said the knocking had a rhythm," he said. 3, then a pause, then 3. "That was Sarah," Chloe said. "She did that every day. She said if anyone ever heard it, they would know it wasn't a rat." She was right. Chloe nodded slowly. "Thank you for coming down the stairs," she said. David could not speak for a moment. "Thank you for making the sound," he said finally. She stood up. Her mother helped her with her jacket. She bent down one more time and pressed her hand flat against Ranger's side, exactly the way she had done the first night in the cellar, wrapped in a silver blanket, on her way up into the rain. The dog held still. He let her keep her hand there. He did not move. He did not look away. Warm and solid and real. She held it there for a long moment. Then she stood up and took her mother's arm, and they walked out of the room and down the corridor and out into the parking lot, where a bright winter sun was coming through the last of the clouds. David stood at the window and watched them get into the car. Ranger sat next to him and watched too. Marie Harden turned back once before she opened the driver's door and lifted a hand. David lifted his in return. The car pulled out of the lot. It turned left onto the main road. It disappeared past the row of trees along the sidewalk. David stood there for a while after it was gone. The town of Millbrook went back to being Millbrook mostly. The rain that had fallen for 2 days on Hadley Road eventually dried out of the walls of the abandoned Colonial, and the county, after some back and forth with the estate in Arizona, had the whole house torn down that spring. They filled in the cellar with fresh dirt. They planted grass over the top. The property was still owned by a nephew who had never seen it, but the nephew had made a request in writing through a lawyer that a small maple tree be planted at the edge of the lot where the driveway used to meet the road. The lawyer had said the nephew had wanted 7 maples, 1 for each girl, but he had been told that 7 trees on that stretch of ground was too many, so they planted one. It was small, thin-trunked, 3 feet tall the first summer. Beth Morris was promoted, not by the captain who had been arrested, of course, by his replacement, who was a woman named Diane Fuller, who had come in from the state, and who told Beth on her first day in the office that she had read every case file Beth had ever worked, and that she had one request, which was that Beth take the corkboard out of her spare bedroom and bring it to the station and hang it on the wall of the conference room where everyone could see it. Beth did. There were fewer red strings on it now. David Klein stayed on patrol. He was offered a detective position, and he thought about it for a week, and then he told Diane Fuller that he was going to stay where he was, at least for a few years, because he had a 7-year-old at home who liked knowing what shifts he was on. Diane understood. She told him the offer would still be there when he was ready. Ranger was 7 years old the summer the maple was planted. He was going a little grey around the muzzle. He still slept at the foot of Emma's bed on windy nights. He still walked her to the bus stop on Tuesdays. He still went to work with David every shift. His hips were slower on the stairs. His nose was as sharp as it had ever been. There was a night, later that year, when David was driving home from a late shift, and he took Hadley Road because the bridge on Kettle Creek was out again after another hard rain. It was almost midnight. His headlights swept across the empty lot where the Colonial had been. The maple was in leaf. Its small, round crown moved a little in the wind. He slowed the car and looked. Ranger, in the back, sat up and looked with him. There was nothing to see, just a small tree on a piece of quiet ground. But David sat there for a moment with the engine idling and thought about a girl in a silver blanket with her hand pressed against a dog's side. And he thought about a woman in a police station at 3 in the morning with a corkboard full of red string and no one to help her. And he thought about a 9-year-old who had been in a hole in the ground and was now sleeping under her own roof in her own bed with her own cat. He thought about how easily he could have handed the noise complaint to the rookie. He thought about how a man with white hair and a scarred hand had sat at a fundraiser 2 years earlier and shaken hands with the woman who would one day put him in prison, and neither of them had known. He thought about rhythm, 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more. Then he took his foot off the brake and drove the rest of the way home. Emma was asleep. His sister, who had watched her that night, was asleep on the couch with a book on her chest. He turned off the lamp. He put a blanket over her. He walked down the hall, past Emma's door, and opened it just wide enough to see the shape of her in the bed and the shape of the dog at the foot of it. Ranger's tail moved once, slowly, across the quilt. "Good boy," David whispered. He closed the door. If this story moved something in you, take a second to hit like, drop a comment about the part that stayed with you, and subscribe to the channel so the next story finds you when it goes up. Real stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, told the way they deserve to be told. You are the reason they keep coming. Stay with us.